Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Stephanie Small, Product Coordinator at BookNet. Welcome to Unlocking the European Market, Preparing to Comply with the European Accessibility Act. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and finally the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose lands you are joining us from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping, and anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space-making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. In the spirit of that acknowledgement, I confirm BookNet's and my own responsibility to mend the sacred hoop with Canada's Indigenous people, to be an ally to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to unite and work alongside one another. For our webinar today, if you're having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Subtitle button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including of their privacy, and be aware of your words and actions. Please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees, or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire code of conduct at bnctechforum.ca/code-of-conduct. Now let me introduce our speakers. Wendy Reid is the Accessibility and Publishing Standards Lead at Rakuten Kobo, a retailer, publisher, and reading system developer for ebooks and audiobooks. She's responsible for Kobo's accessibility and standards work, where she mainly focuses on digital accessibility and standards for ebooks and audiobooks. She is one of the co-chairs of the Publishing Maintenance Working Group and W3C Advisory Board, as well as the editor of the audiobooks W3C recommendation. She has been a speaker at eBookCraft, Tech Forum, Audio Live, London Book Fair, Frankfurt Book Fair, and A11YTO. Chris Saynor is EDItEUR's standards editor, working on standards including ONIX, thema, and EDItEUR. As part of this work, he's involved in the W3C Publishing Group Accessibility Task Force, which is working on guidelines for accessibility metadata display, especially looking at the ONIX standard and making sure it meets the needs for communicating accessibility metadata. Prior to EDItEUR, he worked for a solutions provider in France and was a bookseller for many years in both France and the UK. And with that, over to you, Wendy and Chris.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome everybody. Before I get going, I want to remind you all I am not a lawyer. If I was, I'd probably be wearing a nice suit. So nothing in this presentation may be construed as legal advice supplied by myself or by EDItEUR or by BookNet Canada or Kobo or any other body or individual taking part in this presentation. And remember to always seek legal advice from in-house or your retained counsel to assess responsibilities, compliance, liabilities, or risk. Also, as a word of reassurance, don't panic. Well, at least not too much. If you publish digital titles and have not integrated accessibility into your workflow and are not adding accessibility metadata, then panic a bit. So again, as a person who's not a lawyer, I'm just going to cover a couple of the basic legal points as we're going to be looking at the European Accessibility Act. And I just wanted to outline the difference between two of the main types of European Union laws. Excuse me. First of all, there are EU regulations. These are legal acts that are agreed and passed at the EU level by the three EU institutions, Parliament, Commission, and Council, and are part of the transnational EU laws, and do not need to be added to national law. They are binding and must be observed by all member states. Examples of regulations you may be aware of include EUDR, GPSR, or GDPR. An EU directive sets binding objectives for member states to achieve, but member states can choose how to achieve these goals and need to add them to their own national laws or regulations. Each nation state must respect the objectives and principles and cannot do something that goes against these. Sometimes this approach can lead to variations in interpretation, which are often only then settled through court cases or supplementary opinions from EU institutions. The European Accessibility Act is a directive. Also remember, the regulations and directives will often become part of the legislation of or have to be respected by countries beyond the 27 member states. For example, countries in the European Economic Area, Northern Ireland, even though it's part of the United Kingdom, Switzerland, EU candidate countries, EU overseas territories, European microstates, some other association agreement states and regions, and so on. So respecting the regulations and directives means that you're ensuring your titles meet the requirements of a very large market. To give you an idea, at the end of 2024, the EU population was 449.2 million people. So what is the European Accessibility Act? As I've mentioned, it is a directive. So each member state chooses how to achieve the aims of the directive by implementing their own legislation, which is why you may see variations in interpretation or enforcement in different member states, but the principles remain the same. As an example, in the case of accessible books as a service, There are different interpretations about a clause in the EAA relating to services provided before the application date of 28th of June 2025. The question is if this only applies to titles published or lent after that date, or if it applies to all titles sold or borrowed after that date. If it is the former, then there is a transition period of 5 years with a deadline of 28th June 2030. This is one of the things that now varies in different states and is probably the most frustrating from the lack of clarity in the phrasing of that clause, which will lead to issues that can only be solved by legal opinions and in court cases. But for now, the recommendation is to publish all new titles in an accessible format and work on your backlist and provide at least basic information about the backlist, about any known accessibility features. Also, remember the EAA is about the consumer. It's about making sure that all EU citizens have the same access to goods and services covered by the directive. That's why it exists. And another point to remember is that the EU is not the only territory with legislation. So meeting the requirements of European legislation will future-proof products when similar legislation comes into force in other jurisdictions, as the principles behind the European Accessibility Act come out of work of the United Nations, and so other jurisdictions are likely to adopt similar approaches. The EAA applies to a list of goods and services and is applicable from June 28, 2025. For the book industry, it applies to all digital books and the platforms that they are made available on, as well as e-readers. So if it is possible to access a title as an EU consumer or reader, then the title is covered by this directive. Digital publications are clearly defined as a service and not goods in this directive. So all generic mentions of services in the Act apply to digital books. The directive also applies to websites providing services. So, for example, e-commerce sites selling digital publications or libraries that may loan digital publications, and that could be accessed by an EU-based consumer. It is also important to know that clear and visible information about the accessibility of services and goods is part of the directive. So, metadata matters. I wanted to highlight two clauses in the directive that relate specifically to metadata. The directive says that information about the accessibility of a title must be provided as metadata. There is also an obligation to display this information on websites, and that information has to be displayed in an accessible way. This information must be supplied by the economic operator. So in the case of digital books, the publisher or distributor. If there is no information available in a machine-readable format, then websites will have to either display warnings that the title is of unknown accessibility as no information was provided, or maybe they simply will not display the title. This, of course, also raises questions of legal liability. Who is legally responsible if there is no metadata at all? Probably the publisher, but you need to check with a lawyer. Also, remember, accessibility is important for other EU regulations, like GPSR, which covers product safety, and where information must be provided in an accessible way. So, for example, a simple image will not suffice. Accessibility information should be available with the digital file itself, on websites, and as part of the metadata supply chain. But do not rely on just one of these. So, in an EPUB file, a well-produced title will contain metadata about its accessibility features. This will use vocabulary from EPUB accessibility specification, a vocabulary which was originally derived from schema.org controlled vocabularies, which themselves may also be present in the code used for websites. Remember, not everyone has access to the digital file itself or can extract the metadata from the file. Or you may have formats that are accessible to some extent, but do not have the detailed information in the file on how they are accessible. Therefore, you must also include accessibility information in your supply chain metadata. And the most common way of doing this is ONIX. This makes it available to the whole supply chain in a machine-readable global standard, even before the title is published, or prior to purchase or stocking decisions, or when there's no access to the digital file. Excuse me. ONIX has always been able to communicate about accessible titles, particularly physical formats such as large or ultra-large print, Braille titles, DAISY formats, and ONIX can describe digital formats and their accessibility as well. By the way, if you are still using ONIX 2.1, there are limited options for describing digital accessibility, and 2.1 is now officially an obsolete standard, and we do not recommend its continued use. If you are sending metadata about accessibility or basically anything to do with recent legal requirements, you should really be using ONIX 3 or planning to move to it this year. Any new requirements of the last decade have only been added to ONIX 3 and will only be added to ONIX 3 in the future. ONIX is used to describe the features of a digital publication. It cannot describe the features of a reading system, but it can give enough information so a reader will be able to match their needs and how their preferred reading system works with the right titles, if you have provided this information in the metadata. Also, ONIX works with controlled vocabularies or code lists designed for machine-to-machine communication. And certain things important for accessibility are also important for other parts of the supply chain, so will be part of the relevant code list. For example, information about the format. For all digital titles, it is far better to include at least the basic information, or to say that for the moment the accessibility is unknown. For example, on backlist titles that were published a while ago, rather than maintaining a complete silence and saying nothing at all. Have a maximalist approach to metadata, adding all the possible information, as everything is important to someone in the supply chain, rather than going for a strict minimum. Also, as you review backlist or older titles, you can update your ONIX records as appropriate. So let us look at some of the relevant ONIX codes. First, you need to state it is a digital publication using a format code from list 150. Then, critically, we have to say what format this ISBN is made available in. The most common formats are EPUB and PDF. Then there is other format information, and for accessibility, you need to declare if it's a reflowable title. This means the format allows text to be resized or changed, and the digital page will flow onto another page. The other option is the fixed format or fixed layout. Think of this as an exact replica of the printed version, where a reading device cannot change text size or layout, although usually you can zoom in and out. This information is really important. It tells a potential reader how the content may be read on their device. List 81 is especially important for digital publications, as it sets out what content type is contained in the digital file, how that content is presented, and how information is presented to a reader. You're basically describing how the content is provided. Is it by text, that is text as text, or text as an image, or via still images, or charts, or sequential art, comics, mangas, graphic novels, that kind of thing, or an audio file, or a moving image, and so on. It is the type of content that will it is the type of content that will dictate some of the accessibility requirements. For example, if the publication includes photographs, then these will need alternative descriptions to make the publication accessible. This is not a list to ignore if you are taking accessibility metadata seriously. In ONIX, if there's more than one type of the content, then you will declare one as the primary content type. And for a lot of publications, this will be code 10, text as text. Then list any other type of content using repeats of product content type. Here's a small sample of an ONIX record for a novel in an EPUB 3.3 format. Fully reflowable, consisting of text with only a cover and logo as images. The sample contains codes inside tags, entirely designed to be machine readable and therefore easy to create automated processes. The primary content type is code 10, text, and the other product content type is code 46, decorative images. That is, images that are not necessary for the understanding of the content of the title. As the cover of this title has nothing on it that is not described elsewhere in structured metadata, title, author's name, etc., I have declared it as a decorative image. If the cover had some essential information or its description helps in the understanding of the content, then it would need to have an alternative textual description as part of the metadata of the image itself. For digital accessibility, to complement list 81, you will need to include all the relevant codes from list 196, another list you cannot ignore when communicating about digital accessibility in ONIX. It basically has three types of code. First, information about the conformance of the title to recognized standards like WCAG, EPUB accessibility specification, PDF UA, and so on. Then there are codes for any information relating to certification, such as which organization has done any certification and details of this. The majority of the codes are specific accessibility attributes and describe the way the content is accessible, depending on which reading system is being used. These attributes can be included for any digital format when they are relevant, so for EPUB, PDF, and so on. And this will allow sites to display this information and readers to match their preferred way of reading with the type of content and how that has been made accessible. Here is a look at some of the values on code list 196. And this is the rest of the code list. The headings you see are a definition of the code. And these headings are often accompanied by notes to give extra detail or to help understand how the code is used or what it means. It is the number, the code, which is included in the ONIX file for machine readability. And the heading itself is language independent and can be translated into any language for human understanding. So the codes can be used to describe accessibility features for a title, no matter what the language of the product is or the languages of a potential consumer. As an example of what gets sent in an ONIX record, this is what the granularity of list 196 looks like in an ONIX 3 file. As you can see, it is made of repetitions of the same composite with the relevant codes. It's very easy and logical for creating automated processes linked to this metadata. Okay, the only de facto exemption from the EAA is for micro enterprises, as defined by current EU regulations. If claiming this exemption, a business has to be able to prove this and that they meet the criteria set out by the EU itself. There are also two possible exemptions for individual ISBNs. Disproportionate burden. If this is claimed for a product, then detailed documentation may have to be provided to market surveillance authorities that compliance causes a disproportionate financial burden. So keep proof linked to the ISBN in question. In the case of fundamental alteration, again, keep justification on record to prove the case. No specific editorial category is considered de facto concerned, but it will probably be easier to demonstrate the need for fundamental alteration when it comes to highly visual content like comics and graphic novels, children's picture books, and art books, especially for those that have already been published. Lack of priority, lack of time, lack of knowledge are not legitimate reasons for an exemption. If a title cannot be made fully accessible, it should be as accessible as possible, with the rationale for any limitations documented and available to regulatory authorities upon request. There is no exemption for publishing houses from outside the EU, as the requirements apply to all titles available to readers in the EU. If any of these three apply to you or to an ISBN, you can include the relevant code in your ONIX 3. These options are not part of ONIX 2.1. Even if you're also including some other details about accessibility features, you can include these codes. Even if a title is exempt, potential readers still want to know what they can access, even if that access is limited. Also, other markets where the exemptions do not apply will also still need to know any accessibility features of the title. If you do include these, as with all EU regulations and directives, you need to be able to justify it if challenged legally, so keep records. In the case of most published content, it will usually be published in multiple formats, both physical and digital, so make sure you have clearly linked different formats using related products. So as an example, if a product is available in PDF and also in EPUB, the PDF may be more limited in accessibility, but you can point to the more accessible EPUB format. With certain digital products that could contain flashing images or certain types of sound, you should also include information about possible hazards or the fact that it hasn't been checked and it has been checked and it's okay, or that checks have not yet been done. This does not apply to purely textual content or where there are still images. This is only for moving images and sound. The accessibility metadata has to be made available and displayed to potential readers, buyers, borrowers, or any potential user or consumer of the content. So to help with how the metadata should be displayed, the W3C set up a working group to come up with standardized best practice suggestions for how to display this information. These best practices are not an obligation, and organizations can choose what they do to display the metadata. But the best practices do give good guidance to those in the supply chain to allow them to make sure that the relevant information is available and to give users ideas on how they could display this information. The 3 documents that are already available can be viewed at these links. They are still being edited, but now it's a matter of presentation and styling. All the principles are set out already in these documents. The links are in the chat. Also, if you're watching this live today, there is a webinar tomorrow, January 22nd, run by the DAISY Consortium on metadata, and these 3 best practice documents. It is called Accessibility Metadata T-157 days. DAISY will also make the presentations available on their websites afterwards. That presentation will go into much greater detail about these documents. There are also crosswalks available between standards, as it's important that if you're using one standard to express accessibility, this information can be used in other formats in a clear and standardized way, and that it's easy to automate these processes. To help with this, the W3C has published a crosswalk between EPUB accessibility metadata and schema and ONIX, so that what is reported in one can be reported in a similar way by the other standards. These mappings can be helpful in your workflows, making sure that metadata is available with the digital file and also in the supply chain. And these mappings can be used to automate processes for adding metadata. A draft crosswalk from EPUB and ONIX to MARC, both 21 and UniMarc, are being worked on at the moment. And finally, EDItEUR has also done 2 application notes specifically about accessibility in ONIX, a briefer essentials document, and then an advanced document that covers a lot more detail. Both of these can be downloaded from the EDItEUR website. Thank you very much. And now I shall hand over to Wendy.
Thank you, Chris. Let me share my screen. All right. So, hi everyone. I'm Wendy. I get to follow in Chris's excellent shoes to talk a little bit more about the European Accessibility Act, specifically accessible books and accessible platforms. So first, I do want to start with I'm wearing my W3C hat at the moment. I'm going to be talking specifically about EPUB accessibility standards. And how do we make ebooks accessible and more specifically EPUB accessible? So to start off with, EAA specifically only refers to digital publications as ebooks. And this is a broad term, which means in EAA that this can apply to EPUB, it can apply to PDF, and it can apply to any sort of digital publication. But of course, as we all know, generally within our industry, it's EPUB or it's PDF. Both files can be made accessible. There's lots of documentation out there on EPUB and PDF accessibility, but EPUB currently offers more in terms of support and features for accessibility when it comes to the market and what people use on a day-to-day basis. So consider this in your decisions. The other thing to consider when it comes to ebooks is reflowable versus fixed layout. Reflowable currently is the only way to make an ebook fully accessible because of the requirements for some users around being able to change and modify their text. It is possible, and I want to be really clear about this, it is possible to make really good fixed layout titles that are accessible, but they will never be fully accessible because of that limitation around font size adjustment, font face changes, and things like that. And lastly, regardless of what format you choose or what path you take, follow the standards. There are a lot of standards out there. There's a lot of documentation out there. Use it. So I've mentioned standards, so I might as well talk about the standards. The main one, the one whose name you'll hear thrown around a lot, is WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. It is a standard specifically for the production of accessible content on the web, or by extension in EPUB and other web-based standards. It is also usable outside of the web for content like mobile applications, PDFs, and anything that appears on a digital interface. You can usually find a way to crosswalk WCAG into that standard. The current version is 2.2, though you'll note that in a lot of standards around the world, and especially in laws, older versions are referred to. For instance, here in Ontario, we use 2.0. In EAA, more specifically EN 301549, they refer to 2.1, but 2.2 is the latest version of the standard. WCAG specifically focuses on the perceivability, operability, usability, and robustness of content. And I'll get a little bit more specific about that. EPUB Accessibility 1.1 is a standard specifically for, as the name describes, EPUB and EPUB accessibility standards. This document is around accessibility considerations for EPUB like metadata, media overlays, and conformance reporting. It provides further detail to content authors on how to include those in their EPUB files. Notably, EPUB accessibility as well refers back to WCAG as the standard you should be following for making accessible content. The last part I want to talk about is best practices documents. These are non-official documents in the sense that they don't hold any sort of legal standing or anything, but they are useful. Chris mentioned the UX guide for EPUB accessibility metadata. That is incredibly helpful. There is also, just a few months ago, we released the fixed layout accessibility best practices documentation, and there will be more of this documentation in the future and updates to the documentation, especially as we all learn more about how to produce content, and also as technology improves and reading systems and other platforms change and improve how they present content. When I talk about ebook accessibility and I talk about WCAG and all of the standards, I think what most often happens is people get really overwhelmed. And as Chris said, panic. Don't panic, I promise. Especially when it comes to ebooks, what you mostly have to consider in your ebooks is, the content and what's in it and how you're producing your ebooks. And the reality is that most ebooks on the market today are fairly simple. You have a cover, you have text content within your book, maybe a few additional images throughout the book, but it's mostly text. And fortunately, text is very easy to make accessible, barring doing some very interesting things with your code. And so when I talk about EPUB accessibility with publishers and people in the publishing community, I think it's important to remind you that this isn't that scary. It takes time and it takes effort, but don't be afraid. Don't panic. Just take a very systematic approach. I would say the most common things to consider, the things that I see most often in books and that people need to think about when they're producing their books. Image descriptions. I took liberties here and used a photo of my cat, Alfie. If your book has images, and this includes the cover in some cases, though Chris mentioned most often they're decorative. If your book has images, include descriptions. Include descriptions that are informative, contextual, and concise. It doesn't matter how many images your book has, include them, even if it feels like there's a lot of them, or not that many. The other big one for books in particular is reading order and navigation. So some of this is simple. Some of this is stuff that publishing already does really, really well. Tables of contents, detailed tables of contents, page numbers, all of these things. There are other things that publishers of digital content do need to consider, like ensuring that what we call the programmatic order of their content is the same as the visual order of the content. And what I mean by that is if you were to take how your page looks on your computer and the code that underlies that page, does the order of the content match? Is the heading at the top? Is the, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, image, and so on? That is essential for users of assistive technologies, and it's one of the most important things to remember and can sometimes get lost. And the last is anytime your book contains any sort of multimedia content, audio, video, both, ensure that you're providing accessible alternatives for those. If you have audio, make sure that you're providing transcripts or that audio directly corresponds to content within the book. If you are including video, is that video audio described? If there's, dialogue, is it captioned? Things like that. Simple, hopefully, not so scary. I also thought it was important to talk about what EAA says specifically about ebooks. There is a whole section in EAA about ebooks specifically. And it's a bit legal jargony. And as Chris said, not a lawyer. So do not take this as legal advice or legal interpretation. But EAA says if an ebook contains audio, it must also provide synchronized text. That ebook file should not prevent assistive technologies from operating. That access to content, navigation, and choice and presentation is available. That alternative renditions of the content are allowed. The content is discoverable. And the DRM does not block accessibility features. Translating that to slightly more understandable language, because it's a bit complex and dense, and I think not necessarily written by someone who works in publishing. If the ebook contains audio, it also provides synchronized text, essentially media overlays. If you are including audio in your ebook that isn't supplemental to the main content, and I think this is important, if you have like an audio track that follows the content of your book, make sure they're synchronized. Use media overlays, use Smile. If you are building your EPUB files according to EPUB accessibility and WCAG, you will be okay. You are meeting the standards around transformability, around adjustment, around interaction with assistive technologies by building your books accordingly to the standards. Allowing users to adjust the text means choosing reflowable over fixed layout wherever possible, because there is content that cannot be reflowable, but wherever you can, opt for reflow. And to make it discoverable, include accessibility metadata. Chris went over this in way more detail than I ever will, but accessibility metadata is essential to creating discoverability. And DRM is a really hard topic to talk about and probably could get a session on its own. My recommendation is to talk to your vendors about what DRM they are using. In general, there is no DRM on the market that most of us use that completely blocks accessibility. Where most of the challenges come from are the ability for users to move files around and how accessible the platforms are in terms of being able to use your assistive technology to navigate them to move your files. But it is a worthwhile conversation to have with your vendors to make sure that their DRM has specifically been tested, or you get assurances that there is no issue with DRM and assistive technology. Time to put my other hat on. What is Kobo doing? This is a question I've been asked many times and was asked to include in this discussion as well. In short, many platform updates. As a distributor, seller, platform provider, we have a lot of responsibilities under EAA. We are a product and a service. And so we have had to do a lot to change things for EAA to meet those requirements. I've summed it up into a handful of categories. The first being metadata. We have updated our systems to ingest and display accessibility metadata. You will see these changes actually very soon because they will be going out to our global store, not just in Europe. And to use that accessibility metadata in search. So to allow people to actually be able to modify their searches to look for accessible books. And actually, to go back to metadata quickly, for our publishers, because we actually have a mix of publishers who use ONIX and publishers that use other formats of metadata, including spreadsheets with us. All of our metadata ingestion has been updated to accept the accessibility metadata or some version of accessibility metadata. So if you use the EPUB metadata, if you use ONIX, if you use our spreadsheets, we accept your accessibility metadata. And we'll display it on site. So please send it to us, regardless of what country you sell in. For our website has to be accessible. So we've been working on making our website accessible in a way that meets the standards under EAA and EN 301549 and WCAG. We have been updating things like marketing assets, help pages, all the nooks and crannies of a large web platform to make sure that they meet requirements, and those updates will be ongoing. So you'll likely see some changes on our site, but honestly, most things are kind of hidden, and you probably won't see any visual changes, but you might, if you use a screen reader on our website, you might notice some functional changes. We have been in the process of updating all of our reading platforms, our mobile applications, our web reader, our hardware devices to meet accessibility requirements. In the relatively short term, you will see the launch of features like text-to-speech on our platforms, probably in the next couple of months. Longer term, you'll see really big updates to things like our e-reader platforms to add new software and new functionality. And the last bit I'll talk about, because this is part of it, is communication and ensuring that we are communicating with our partners, our publishers, and our authors on everything related to EAA. This is an ongoing process. So if many people have probably heard from parts of our team already, but if you haven't, you probably will. And I encourage anyone who has questions specifically around what is Kobo doing, how does this affect me? Do I need help? I need help. I don't know what to do. Please reach out to myself or to anyone on any of your contacts on our publishing teams or our vendor management teams. we're here to help you. We are happy to chat and make this as easy as possible for you. So don't be afraid. Don't panic. I also have resources. This is where I'll wrap up. But I have several resources and links for people. I think these will get shared out as well. But if you're saw me talk about all these things and don't know what they are, I have links. Don't worry. And I noticed that there's been lots of links shared in the chat already as well. So hopefully everyone is prepared. I'll stop there. I believe I'm passing this over to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Wendy and Chris, for all that fantastic information. So now that we have that under our belts, I want to demonstrate an example of how a platform can make use of the accessibility metadata that publishers provide. And today we'll be using Catalyst, which is the cataloging and order system here at BookNet, as an example. And we're going to go through two scenarios today. So first, let's say you already have a digital book in mind and you want to learn about the accessibility features that it has so you can assess whether that specific book will meet your needs. So I'm just going to copy in an ISBN there. You could put in the title, whatever you like. If that product is in Catalyst, we'll be brought directly to this title detail page, which gives you a whole host of information about the book. For our purposes, we want to look at accessibility information. So down the left-hand side of the page, we have this heading for accessibility. And if we click on that, it expands the section and we'll see a fairly typical listing of accessibility information for the book. There's some certification information that we talked about, some specific accessibility features, and there's also, in this case, a publisher contact if you need more accessibility information than what is provided. Now, if a publisher hasn't provided any accessibility information for the title that you're looking for, currently on Catalyst, you just won't see this heading, and obviously you won't see these details. But as long as it's provided, this is where you would find it. And it is worth mentioning that Catalyst has an ongoing project to review the way that we display accessibility information to make sure that it's meeting people's needs and also the various requirements. So stay tuned. There may be potential improvements in the future. So that's how we find accessibility information for a specific title. But here's another scenario. What if you don't have a book in mind and you just want to see what is out there? Oops. So Catalyst has an accessible digital products search that you can use to help narrow in on the titles that fit your needs. And we can find this in our advanced search form. And you're probably all experts on how to use advanced search forms, so you know that you can be as exact or as broad as you want with your search criteria in order to pull up the type of books that you're looking for. But the main thing you're going to want to do when looking for accessible books is to tick this checkbox in the middle here for accessible products. That's going to do two things to limit your results. First of all, it's going to limit you to digital products. And second, it's only going to show you products that have some form of publisher-supplied accessibility metadata. Now, for my example, I want to keep it fairly broad, so I'm going to look for available books by Canadian authors, and the books have to be accessible. So as we run the search, Catalyst is looking through the database to find titles that meet those criteria. You can see at the top, we have about 1,500 titles that meet the criteria that I chose. It's not a massive amount, but it's enough to maybe be a little bit overwhelming to go through in one sitting. And we can probably guess that some of the results may not have the features or the information that we need. So we can narrow these results down to be a little bit more specific, and you'll do that by using the filters on the left-hand side, specifically the ones for accessibility. As you can see, we have 3 top-level categories that you can filter on, and they'll be familiar to us from our first example. So there's some certification information, specific accessibility features, as well as contact information. So let's narrow down by feature. If I click on that checkbox, it's going to expand into a list of all the accessibility features that at least one book from the search is said to have. And then that number in parentheses there is how many books have that feature. So let's say I'm looking specifically for books with dyslexia readability. If I click that checkbox, all on the right-hand side, all of the books are going to update to reflect that choice. And we can see that at the top two of our 1,500 books, 73 of them have this data. Now, word of caution, you can select more than one option if you want to, but if you do, you'll see the results that have the first feature that you selected, you'll see results that have the second feature that you selected, and you'll see results that have both features. So your results count may go up if you select more than one option. So that's really just two examples of accessibility metadata in practice. I just want to end by saying two things that are probably pretty obvious, but that maybe bear repeating. The first is that if you're not already sending accessibility metadata for your books, particularly your digital products, now's the time. It helps people determine if your books meet their needs. And of course, as we learned, you'll have to make sure that you're meeting the requirements of EU regulations, for example, if you want to sell books there. The second point that I want to make is that, as you can probably guess, the more accessible digital titles that platforms like Catalyst have available, the more useful that system is as a discovery tool, whether it's for librarians or teachers or readers looking for accessible books. So if you're a publisher and you have digital titles with accessibility information, please consider adding those ISBNs to Catalyst to make them searchable for those people who are very motivated to find them. So I will stop sharing. And I think we have a little bit of time, not a lot, to get to some of the questions from the chat. I'll just go through maybe some highlights. If we don't get to your question as part of the session, if you want to, you could send in an email, techforum@booknetcanada.ca, and we will try to get your question to the right person. So first question that we will look at today, is there a page list in the EPUB mandatory to comply with the European Accessibility Act? I think that is a Wendy or Chris. Wendy question?
Not a lawyer. As far as I understand, no, pageless is not required. Pageless is also probably not required more specifically because not all books have page lists. If it's a digital first publication, it never had a page list to begin with. And so what page list would you be referring to? But no, it's not there. In EAA itself, there's no specific call out for page list. We have it in the EPUB metadata because it is if you have access to a page list, it is really good to add to your ebook for usability purposes.
Okay, there are a couple of questions about graphic novels and other fixed layout heavy type of books. Is there help for those of us who publish picture books and graphic novels to create alt text? If anyone knows of any tools or...
Off the absolute top of my head, I can't name a tool. I can say that there is resources. Accessible Publishing Canada has resources. Diagram Institute has resources. Daisy Knowledge Base has resources on writing alt text. Honestly, there's Google how to write alt text. There's a lot out there, and in the area of picture books and graphic novels, there's people who have already done stuff, and there's lots of information. You can also use, someone's pointing to alttext.ai. It's AI alt text has gotten a lot better over time for sure, and it's definitely a tool to use in your toolbox. The thing that I tell anyone who's using it APLN, that's what, yeah, thank you, Natalie. Um, the thing I say with AI and using it is it's a great place to start. You have to have a human touch in your alt text. Otherwise, it will not be contextual. It will not fully serve the user.
Okay. Here's a question. Can you provide an example of a cover that would qualify as more than decorative? For
Hmm.
instance, would reading lines or bullets describing detailed aspects of nonfiction content trigger a necessity to mark the cover as non-decorative and provide alt text? That's very
The
detailed.
I'll tell you this. The reason I talk about covers being decorative is there's a open debate about whether you should provide alternative descriptions for covers or not. Some say that you should. If you're doing your metadata really well in ONIX or in an Excel file, you're giving all the titles, authors, information, and anything that appears on a website on your cover is also available in a textual format. It doesn't matter. I have seen audiobooks, though, for example, where it says on the picture, you're on the website, read by X, uh, 9 hours, there's information on that cover. So if you put information on the cover that is not available elsewhere, that's important for the person who may want to to purchase or to borrow that title, then you need to put that information in the alternative description as well. Or if you've created a cover that you think is an essential part of understanding the content, then that's also an image.
Okay. This is from a Canadian company. On our company website where we sell our books, do we need to have the accessibility features displayed for each book on their book page?
Okay, not a lawyer, but if your books are if anybody in the EU could technically purchase or borrow your book, or then you should be displaying the accessibility features because it's a consumer-led piece of legislation. So if the book is available to any part of the EU, yes. If you don't sell to the EU, it's still a good thing to do because you have your own domestic audience. It's good practice to tell people we have these titles and they are accessible. Um, of the 449.2 million people in the EU, there's an estimated 80 million that have accessibility needs. I don't know the same statistics for Canada, but it must be a large proportion. It must be a relatively large percentage as well. So that information helps. The United States has the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is getting updated, I believe, next year. And there are requirements there, and I know the United States is still a big market for Canada, so that could be important as well. So, but from a legal point of view, if your titles are available to anybody in the EU, if I could go, if I was in France now and I went to your site and I could access that title, then I should also be able to access information about accessibility.
Okay. I think we're going to have to call it there because we're past time. So if anyone has a real burning question that they did not get answered, please send them our way and we will try to direct them to the correct person to give you a good answer. So let's just wrap up by saying thank you so much. Oh,
Can I just suggest if somebody at BookNet can copy all the questions and then
we
send
have
it
them
to,
recorded.
okay, we could reply in writing to you.
I'm not
Okay.
sure that we necessarily have the names associated with them, but in the background while we're wrapping up, I'm sure someone can record that for me. Okay, so thank you both for joining us today. Before we go, we'd love it if all our attendees could provide feedback on this session. We will drop a link to the survey in the chat, so if you can take a couple of minutes to fill it out, that would be awesome. We'll also be emailing a link to the recording of this session as soon as it's available. We invite all our attendees to join our upcoming session, Green Paths, Building a Sustainable Future in Bookselling, which is scheduled for January 28th. You can find information about all of our upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website, bnctechforum.ca. And lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to you all for attending today.
Thank you.